everyone, and welcome back to my channel True Crime and Trials, and today I will be covering day one of the Robert Durst trial. So as always, we open with opening statements, and the prosecution is up, and he warns everyone that this is going to be a lengthy statement, and even he doesn't know how long it's going to take, and we've had 2 days of this trial and he's still not finished. So he starts by saying this case involves 3 different murders: Kathy Durst, which was Bob's wife, Susan Berman, which the trial's about, and Maurice Black, who he dismembered and threw into the ocean and got acquitted of murdering. He said it was self-defense. So on the 24th of December 2000, they play the 911 call from that night, and it was from a neighbour of Susan's who was concerned about her because her dogs were running around the neighbourhood, which was very unusual. So now they show a picture of Susan's property, the garage, and he says the officers weren't expecting a murder scene. They'd just been told that, you know, a concerned neighbour had called in and her dogs were running around the neighbourhood. So I will warn you now, they did show pictures of Susan's body. I'm going to show them. If you don't want to see them, just look away for 10-15 seconds. And the officers could obviously see she'd been shot, and the defence say that the motive wasn't robbery or burglary because there were no signs of forced entry, no ransacking, or signs of a struggle. Susan's purse was still there, along with credit cards and everything. The defence says she knew her killer because obviously she'd been shot in the back of the head, so she'd obviously let whoever in, knowing them, and turned away from them, and then obviously been shot in the back of the head. Then he moves on to the cadaver note, which I mentioned in the backstory, and showing what it says on it, and all it says is Susan's address and then the word cadaver, which is a medical term which they link to Bob's wife Kathy, who went to medical school. There will be a number of witnesses that went to medical school with Kathy. So now he starts with a slideshow about who is Robert Durst, and he says the 2 brothers that Bob has, Thomas and Douglas, will be testifying in this case. So then, I mean, this statement is, you know, it goes forwards and then it goes backwards, then it slips another story in, so it might sound higgledy-piggledy and all over the place, but that's just how it's done. The defence say Durst believes the rules don't apply to him. I agree, because they're playing interviews from when the filmmakers did the interviews, but they are the unedited versions. There's interview when he was arrested. So they play an interview of Robert telling a story of when he was younger, as in maybe early 20s, when he lied to get food stamps and he got a kick out of it, and, you know, liked the fact that he was getting food stamps and he didn't need them and getting away with it, and, you know, conning the government out of money. And in another interview he told another story about shoplifting a bottle of water from an airport. He's a millionaire, he doesn't need to do these things, but he seems to have a reason as to why he does this. Then in the interview after his arrest in New Orleans in 2015, he tells the exact same story to them. I don't know. Is he a narcissist? Because why would you tell this kind of story if not for attention, or to make yourself out to be, you know, a rule breaker, rebellion? It's weird. Robert says it wasn't how he was raised, but it's just who he is. They now play Robert telling another story about he burps in public. Isn't bothered, he'll just do it. He even does it in business meetings, and he will just burp and carry on with what he's doing. And he thinks it shows people that he's not going to follow the simplest of rules. So now you see the kind of mindset that Robert Durst has. He says it was rebellion because he didn't want to work in the family firm, and to me that's just childish. Now they play an interview that was done with Bob's younger brother Douglas, and Douglas says that Bob was very tight with money. So then they say Bob met Susan at UCLA, and it was nothing more than a close friendship. Then they move on to a guy called Nick Shavin, who was the best friend of both Bob and Susan, but I think he was closer to Susan. And the defence say he's going to be a very important witness in this case, because he was close to Susan and she would speak to him about a lot of things, and Susan would tell Nick how much she loved Bobby, and that's what a lot of people call him. Then they move on to another friend called Lorraine Newman, and she will testify about how close Susan and Bob were. And they show a picture of Bob and Susan, and Bob says that Susan was his best friend and she would do anything for him. So then they move on to the story about who is Susan Berman, and she was an only child of Gladys and David Berman, and Susan's father was a notorious gangster known as Davy the Jew Berman, and he replaced Bugsy Siegel's running of the Flamingo Hotel after he was killed by the New York mobsters in approximately the 1950s. Susan grew up in Las Vegas. She was like the princess of Las Vegas and was very close to her father. Now, Susan's father was a founding member of Murder Incorporated, which is a crime organisation that was responsible for many contract murders in the 1930s and 40s. But by the time Susan was 12, her parents were dead. Her father died during surgery and her mother was institutionalised and died. And the defence say that due to her upbringing with the mafia and everything, if you watch films and things, you know how tight they are, and, respect, loyalty. So they say that's why she was very loyal to her friends. And Bob says he and Susan would spend a lot of time together. The defence says that Susan could also be very manipulative, and one of her friends say that one way or another she would get what she wanted, and she would, hint that she had something on that person that she wanted something from. Another friend said she was emotionally manipulative and brilliantly charming. But Susan was always in survivalist mode. So now they go on to who is Kathy Durst, and Kathy was 19 when she met Robert, who was 29. Bob says when meeting Kathy's family that he was forced to spend time with an average American family and he despised it. On the 12th of April 1973, Bob and Kathy got married. They moved back to New York, where Kathy went to nursing school and Bob went back to work at his family firm. They also purchased a lakeside cottage in South Salem. The defence says Bob was unfaithful numerous times, but Susan was as well. So they say Bob was very controlling of Kathy. In 1976, Kathy found out she was pregnant, and they had a big argument about it because Bob had told her that he didn't want kids. So he told her if she kept the baby then they'd get a divorce. So she had an abortion, and obviously things changed in the marriage and the domestic violence began. He would also give Kathy a small budget, and she would have to manage with that budget because he was giving her nothing more. Then we go on to Susan again, because while all this were going on, she became a successful journalist and had a good group of friends. She wrote an article on Nick Shavin, who became best friends with her and Nick, so that's where they met. And then we go back to Robert, of when he was speaking about when he and Kathy were arguing and pushing and slapping. And the defence say Bob was basically wanting to take control of Kathy's ever-growing independence. And in an interview with Bob, he tells of a story where they went to a gathering and Bob wanted to leave and she didn't, and he went back in and grabbed her by the hair. What more can you say about that? Kathy began to take cocaine and abused sleep medication due to her marriage deteriorating and the pressure of medical school. And it says Kathy had 2 affairs. In 1981, Kathy was preparing to divorce Bob. And they continued to speak about the divorce and speak about, the properties they have and what they were doing with those. In September of 81, the abuse worsened and Kathy sought refuge at her neighbours, and this was in one of the apartments that they had, and the abuse got that bad that she climbed out of the window and went round to her neighbours, and she told the neighbour that Bob had a gun. And Bob freely speaks about this in this interview, it doesn't matter. I don't know, it's just... And the neighbour said, obviously, that she was absolutely terrified. And then the defence says that the evidence will show Bob killed Kathy, and they say this quite a lot in this opening statement. And obviously the prosecution... Right, I've been saying the defence, I don't know why I'm saying the defence. I mean, the prosecution say that the evidence will show Bob killed Kathy, but the defence obviously keep objecting to this because, it's just... hearsay and there's nothing, to prove that he killed Kathy. Despite all the abuse, Kathy and Bob still spent time together, and on the 31st of January in 1982, at their lakeside cottage at South Salem, they were there together, and that was the last night Kathy was ever seen alive again. The next day, Kathy was due to turn up at work at the hospital, but obviously she didn't turn up, and it took Bob 4 days to report Kathy missing. But when he did, he told the story of her. She'd been out drinking and come home and said she wanted to drive to the apartment in New York, and Bob said, no, you're not. You've been drinking. I'll drive you to the train station and you can get the train into New York. And that's what he said. But then in an interview in 2010, Bob admits he and Kathy had a violent argument that night. But then the next day, when they're interviewing him again, he says he can't remember saying what he said the day before, and he said he'd put her on a train. So sometimes I forget. I think he forgets what he said and what lies he's told. Durst told numerous lies about the night Kathy went missing. Durst reported her missing to law enforcement in the city and not in South Salem because the prosecution say this is because, he wanted the focus of the search to be in New York and not in South Salem. Bob said that whatever happened to Kathy after he dropped her off at the train station was a result of her drug use, her promiscuity, and the criminal companions she had. And as all this is ramping up, Bob goes to Susan Berman to be his spokesperson. Susan tells law enforcement that she thinks Kathy's disappearance has something to do with drugs, and she and Bob spread similar negative stories about Kathy to the press. They also said she was having a breakdown and was doing badly at medical school. And the prosecution show a summary of the version of what Durst said happened, and then the prosecution show a version of what they think happened. A phone call was made to the dean of the hospital, and supposedly it was Kathy ringing in sick, but then we find out that it was Susan Berman, and she told a number of friends that she'd made that phone call. In an interview with one of Susan's friends, Susan told her about the phone call and that if anything happened to her, it was Bobby that did it, and a lot of people, a lot of these friends called him Bobby. Susan told another friend that she gave Bob an alibi because he was a friend and she loved him. Bob had told her that Kathy had had an accident, she'd had a fall, and he needed Susan's help. Susan told Nick that Bob had killed Kathy, Nick Shavin, and he asked her how she knew that he'd killed Kathy, and she said, "He told me, and we have to protect Bob." On the 1st of February, Bob went to a store that sold cleaning products and things, but he never told law enforcement that he'd done this. Kathy's sister and her husband went to the Lakeside Cottage in South Salem, obviously to look for, Kathy's belongings and things. They found a piece of paper in the trash, which has now become known as the dig note. Bob is shown this note and he admits to writing it, but he can't remember why he wrote it. When Bob reported Kathy missing, he told law enforcement that she was wearing a pair of diamond earrings. Now, these same earrings Kathy's sister found in a drawer in one of the apartments her and Bob owned. The property manager at the apartment where Kathy was living was told by one of the residents that the compactor in the basement was broken, it was jammed up, so she went down to find out what was going on, and as she was pulling things out of the compactor, she saw it was clothes, personal belongings, makeup, notebooks. So she looked at these belongings to see if she could find a name, and in one of the notebooks it was Kathy's name. And she was shocked because Kathy had only been missing a week, so she found it very odd that a husband of a woman that was missing was throwing all her stuff out. And the defence say Bob did this because he knew she wasn't coming back. And Bob had also thrown out all Kathy's stuff from the Lakeside Cottage in South Salem. In 1994, Bob was set to be the head of the family firm, but he was passed over for his younger brother Douglas, so he left the firm in New York and went to California. So then we go back to Susan, and in June of 1983, I'm saying defence and I mean prosecution, so please excuse me. I really don't know why I'm saying defence instead of prosecution. I've wrote it down as defence. I know it's prosecution. I'm sorry. I don't know why. Right. In June of 1983, Susan was married and Bob attended the wedding, and he actually walked her down the aisle. Unfortunately, this husband became addicted to drugs and Susan reluctantly divorced him, and in 1986 he died of a heroin overdose. Susan began dating again, and in 1987 met Paul Kaufman, who was an old classmate, and he had 2 children, and Susan became the mother to these 2 children. Even though she didn't adopt them, she became a very strong mother figure. But then Susan lost all her money in a musical production that her and Paul were trying to produce, but it never opened, so she lost everything. He left her, but she still continued to be a mother to his 2 children. She also lost her house and rented a little down and out property in Beverly Hills. And this was the property where she was murdered. And they now show pictures of what it looked like. I mean, it wasn't very nice, really. Bob had given Susan large amounts of money, but her financial situation just got worse. Then, in late 1999, New York police began secretly reinvestigating Kathy's disappearance. But Bob really didn't seem bothered by it when he found out. So that's the end of day one. So day two is the prosecution's opening statement continued. So until then, bye for now.